Welcome to The Big Story. The Big Story, of course, we continue to look at what happened in Kenya on Friday. The Supreme Court of Kenya annulled the re-election of President Uhuru Kenyatta. There were issues with this election, and they ordered another election in 60 days. In 21 days, at least from Friday, that is when the Supreme Court of Kenya is meant to give its reasons, the detailed reasons why they annulled this election. Let's see how this gets to impact Uganda, but also jurisprudence, not just in Kenya, but in East Africa and Uganda for that matter. And joining us is a lawyer, Nicholas Opio. Good morning, Nicholas.
Hi, good morning, Joe, and thank you for having me here this morning.
Almost every lawyer that I spoke to was elated about what happened in Kenya. They were excited. Are you?
There's good reason to be excited when there's new jurisprudence. Every lawyer would want to see the boundaries of the law tested and pushed to the very extreme limit to see how much we can and cannot do. And so, while many of us are surprised by the decision of the court, we are pleasantly surprised by it.
You were surprised. Why were you surprised? I'm sure you followed keenly as this was playing out. Did you not think that Odinga's team had good enough evidence they were adducing?
I think it's not about the evidence or lack of it, but rather about the trend of Supreme Court dealing with election petitions of that nature. We've seen that in Kenya on one other occasion. We've seen that in Uganda on, I think, 2-3 occasions now. And all over the continent. We just had one such election petition in, I think, Seychelles, where the Supreme Court declined to overturn the election. It looked as though it was nearly impossible for an election petition to be overturned by the Supreme Court in any African country, much less in countries around the world.
What do you see about, in 2005, here in Uganda, our president said that courts, are there to judge chicken thieves and so on. That was, of course, after the court did overturn the Referendum Act. Parliament, of course, got together and they found a way of sanitizing that. And we now hear Odinga, not Odinga, but Raila Uhuru, castigating and lambasting.
Raila Uhuru, I have no, who is that?
Did I say Raila Uhuru?
Yeah.
Here we are. That's how much confusion this decision threw us into. By the way, I was watching and my jaw literally dropped. I was as shocked as you were. But when Uhuru Kenyatta calls them Wakora. Wakora, I understand, is a word to mean crooks.
Scoundrels.
Scoundrels.
Well.
What does this show of our respect for the judiciary, and do you think this will impact how things go forward?
Well, first of all, I think that Kenya, in the aftermath of the 2008 election, embarked on a process of building institutions, of making sure that power was devolved. And that reform process led to at least fairly credible institutions in Kenya, both in terms of governors, parliament, the judiciary. The presidency lost most of its powers and power was devolved. And so they built very strong institutions. The reactions of all the leaders in the aftermath of the Supreme Court ruling undermined the institutions that Kenyans worked so hard to build. Raila has gone after the IEBC, not just disagreeing with their decisions, but really going after them and calling them names. On the other hand, you have Uhuru, who has also gone after not just the decision of the court, but the individuals in the courthouse and calling them all kinds of names. I think that undermines the incredible efforts that the Kenyan people undertook to reform their institutions in the aftermath of the last election. Secondly, and more importantly, it exposes the true characters of these leaders. I mean, don't forget that in the aftermath of the violence in Kenya, Uhuru was saying, don't be vague, go to The Hague. When they eventually went to The Hague, he began to go after the ICC in all kinds of manners. He was the same guy who, after the election was announced, urged the opposition, if they were discontented, to go to court, and then turns around and begins to attack the court in ways that then exposes his true character, that he's a pseudo-democrat. He's, in fact, in the inner being, a person who doesn't really care as much as he says he does about the rule of law.
Do you see any relationship between the appointment of judges in Kenya and in Uganda and the way they get to dispense justice? Because in Kenya, it's open vetting. Literally what the president does is sign at the end of the day when he has little to do. They've gone through the process and what can you do? But it's a different situation altogether. We hear that, for example, Justice Kavuma was not on the list that was sent by the Judicial Service Commission, making it an illegality. I think there's 2 cases to that effect. How does this appointment in any way get judges to behave independently or otherwise?
Well, there are two things. There's the process argument that the Kenyan process is robust, is transparent, and gives you the very best that Kenya has to join the bench. So that's a process argument, which is also an important argument. The second argument that is often not heard is that if you look at that bench and the bar that argued that case, in between the bench and the bar, there were, I could count over 8 PhDs. I could count established scholars and jurists on both the bar and the bench. I shudder to think about the Supreme Court in Uganda. If you look at the Supreme Court, the number of people you'd call pure jurists, they're very few. And so the Kenyan bar has so much grown, it is so big and so advanced that some of the most educated lawyers, some of the most educated judges now find themselves in the courtroom practicing the law. If you take away the Supreme Court of Uganda, let's look at the last election petition and compare that with Kenya. The quality of manpower in that house is incomparable. So the Kenyan bar has grown so much so that both the bar and the bench will give you their very best to argue their most important cases. In Uganda, you can say the standards are much lower. I don't know how many PhDs were in that room when the election petition was being argued. It is not to say the Ugandan bar is trash, but that if you compare that to Kenya, there is, of course, a much more robust and much more advanced bar than we have in Uganda. And so if you then talk about process, that process can only produce their very best if that process is transparent, if that process is credible. And the Kenyan process, I dare say, was one of the very best processes we've had in the region in choosing judges, in people applying, in open vetting, in knowing that the person who made it to the bench is a person who is at least of good character and good quality as a judge.
How do we get there as a country? Do we have the interest to get there anyway, politically?
I think that we only have to have the political will. We know we need to get there. The political will to get there is a different matter altogether. I think all of us believe that we need a good judiciary because a good judiciary is important to the economic development of a country. A good judiciary is important for the rule of law in a country. It is the symptom of democracy. But what do we have in Uganda? A judiciary that is completely deprived of resources, completely deprived of authority. We now have a judiciary that mirrors the image of President Museveni because it's been in power for so long. Every single judge on that bench now was appointed by President Museveni. So it mirrors the political image and inclination of President Museveni in so many ways. And so we need to garner enough political support and goodwill to take us to that level. And I don't think that there is that support now, both to the institution of the judiciary, but also to making that judiciary independent. Because just look at how the judiciary is treated in Uganda. Look at, I don't know in any country where the Chief Justice goes begging for money in Parliament. The judiciary consumes less than 0.001% of the national budget in terms of its financial kitty. And so that judiciary is a judiciary that doesn't seem to be taken as seriously as the other arms of government, and therefore deprived of resources, deprived of human resources. For a very long time, we haven't had a fully constituted court. The High Court still has vacancies. The Court of Appeal still has vacancies. The Supreme Court still has vacancies. Just imagine if Parliament had vacancies. There would be a crisis. If executive had vacancies, there would be a crisis. But why should an equal and important arm of government, like the judiciary, be treated the way it is treated? That the judiciary has to beg for money from the executive. So I don't think that there's real political will to ensure that the judiciary in Uganda is robust, is independent, is as powerful as it should be. But more importantly, we don't appreciate the judiciary as an important arm of the state that plays an equally important role in the economic development of our country, in our democracy.
Remind me if I've forgotten, have you observed elections anywhere before?
Yes, I have.
Yes, you have. And the reason I ask is because I want to talk about observers.
Yeah.
The Carter Center, headed by John Kerry, former Secretary of State. Of course, there was COMESA, there was AU, there was EU, and almost all of these gave that election a clean bill of health. And here we are. So everybody is thinking, wait a minute, how relevant are these observers? That's one. Two, do they actually write their script way before they even get into the country? That it is the same template, that, elections were free and fair, etc., etc. They say that, and then the court says another thing altogether. What do you see there?
Election observers are an important element of an electoral process. Things perhaps could have been worse, but for election observers. In the case of Uganda, we know that they averted several polling day irregularities by just simply being there and documenting it. So the principle that election must be observed by independent actors is important. What I think, though, that they need to reflect on is methodology, because elections have gone high-tech. Results are being transmitted through the cloud. In many places now, people are voting using electronic means. And so election observers, if they want to remain relevant, must examine their methodology that reflects the advancements in our elections in as far as the use of technology. But more importantly also in terms of time frame. You cannot come to a country and take elections as an event of say, a concert of 2 days, a concert of 1 week, or of 2 months. Election is an entire process that is so intricate, that you have to know the nuts and bolts of the election, the nuances, the things that lead up to the election. If you just show up and announce a result free and fair, you'll be embarrassed like John Kerry has been embarrassed, because you behave like a researcher who sat at the hotel in Sheraton and wrote a report about research work in Ngulu. That's exactly what they have become. So we must re-examine methodology. We must re-examine the timing and how long observers stay in an election, because they risk becoming irrelevant in elections that are now high-tech, that are so complicated and involve so many actors over a long period of time.
The so what question, and I was chit-chatting with my colleagues about that, because here in Uganda, almost every observer lambasted our election process. They talked of irregularities and so on and so forth. Some sounded even harder if you looked at the EU report. But so what? The Supreme Court said, look, this gentleman was validly elected. It's business as usual. We have moved on. In Kenya, they said something else altogether. It's a different story altogether. So what, these observers?
Well, first of all, you must understand that the process of building a democracy is a long process, and every single effort at every single turn contributes to that process. And election observation missions might appear utterly useless for a particular cycle of election. But if you take a long-term view, just take the electoral reform argument in Kenya. A lot of the reforms that the Kenyan state undertook in the last election, I mean after the election before the last, were as a result of recommendations by election observers, among other people who made recommendations. So these recommendations might appear for the time being perhaps not very useful, but if you take a long-term view, the players and actors in the electoral process take that very, very seriously. And I give an example of what happened in Kenya, and people have paid too much attention on what happened on voting, on Judgment Day. But the actual important events that led up to that court decision happened 2 months before the Judgment Day. It was the case of Maina Kayaya versus IABC that sought to make a declaration, and the court made that declaration, that results declared at a polling station is the final result for that polling station, and that the Electoral Commission's role was merely to announce that result. They couldn't vary it, they couldn't vet it. That was an important juncture in the Kenyan election petition, because it only reduced the EC, the IABC, to the role of transmitting the result and announcing what was announced as a final result at a polling station. Now, the second important thing in that election was that the court also allowed private citizens access to Electoral Commission databases and logs if they wanted to, under the Access to Information Act. And that therefore formed the very basis of the application by the NASA coalition in the election petition that they had. And so the important events that shaped this decision happened 2 months before the decision itself. And I think people have not paid much attention to that process, because if you go back and look at the Maina Kayaya case, because what the NASA coalition realized, that election theft is often not done at the ballot. Election theft is done at transmission. And once they secured transmission and put the transmission process open to public scrutiny, but also a very, very highly, honest process, then they had secured the pathway to avoiding any electoral theft. And so, therefore, we must look at these processes, not just the election petition and the ruling of the court, but the things that led up to that ruling. And those things were significant in my view, and not much attention has been paid to it. So folks like Maina Kiaye, George Kegoro, Gladwell Othieno, Don Dare and the group must be applauded. Little wonder the Uhuru government is very upset about their work, and have moved to try and close them up.
There's some pundits that are raising concern of, all right, you have annulled the election, and you are saying the EC should conduct another election in 60 days, but you only gave a summary. No details. You're going to release that in 21 days, and some people are thinking, so there's going to be a stalling of work until the 21 days elapse, because the EC needs to, the IEBC in their case, needs to know where did they goof up, what did they get wrong, and they cannot do that now. Do you feel that concern?
No, that's absolutely inaccurate. First of all, if the court hadn't delivered its judgment on the day it did, there would be a constitutional crisis, because the Kenyan constitution required the court to make a finding within a particular time frame. There was a time frame for filing, a time frame for making a decision. So the court needed to make a finding one way or the other. Because of time constraints, it was impossible for the court to write a detailed, reasoned decision, given that they only had about 2 or 3 days. So what the court did was to quite quickly peruse through the evidence and go through the arguments made by counsel in the case. And the court therefore found that there were violations. And importantly, what the court in Kenya did was to make a fundamental departure from what in Uganda was known as the substantiality rule, that it is okay to rig elections as long as you don't rig too much as to alter the results of the election, because that's really what the substantiality test means. In Kenya, what the Kenyan constitution, judges did was to stick to the law, that if the elections were conducted in a manner that violates the very principles of conduct of elections, that election, no matter its effect on the result, is null and void. That's a fundamental departure from what was done here in Uganda. But that said, it doesn't mean that every institution has to stall and wait for the court's reasoned decision in order to be able to carry out its work. The IEBC must get back to work now. In any case, the ruling of the court was very clear about the areas where they failed: transmission of results. The question of Form 34A, which are final results at a polling station, and the results being declared in Form 34B, in Form 35B, that was then the problem. So the only area they have to look at is really the question of transmission, the integrity of transmission of results from polling stations to the National Tally Center. So the Kenyan institutions don't have to wait for the court's detailed ruling for it to function. It is the requirement of the law. The elections then must be held in 60 days. If they don't do that, it will be a constitutional crisis, and therefore they just have to get to work regardless. Let's
talk a bit more about the substantiality test now that you talk about it. Some lawyers have said that, of course, it's still nebulous. It's at the discretion of the judges in our case. But that there be something slight, and then you decide, okay, let's throw out the baby with the bathwater. And yet on the flip side, you want to safeguard the law, because if the law says A and you do B, then you are wrong, and then, we have got to decide otherwise. How to try and make sure every side, if you like, is taken care of? That these ones who are petitioning, if there have been irregularities, they feel justice has been, given to them. But also these ones on this other side, if there was something slight, that we, like I said, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
I think there are two important points in response to your question, Joe. First, that we must have the confidence in our institution, that when they make a decision, they do so from a place of good faith, from a place of honesty, and based on the of the evidence before them. That's one. Belief, trust in our institution. Two, the court then must ask themselves, if they have their allegiance to the law as opposed to the facts of the case. If the court pays fidelity to the law, the court must uphold the rule of law. The court then must make a finding based on the law as opposed to the results. Results in themselves are important, but not necessarily too important that they must trump the law, because laws are not made in vain. We must uphold the law, the rule of the game for which we have made for ourselves, and that once those rules are violated, it is therefore unfair, it is therefore wrong. Because to argue in the way that the Supreme Court in Uganda argued, and many of us have disagreed, that would essentially mean you're allowing theft of an election, you know, as long as you can steal but not steal too much. I think the theft of any election must be frowned upon, and the courts must put their foot down and say, anybody who steals election, anybody who conducts election in violation of our laws will be doing so against the law, and therefore that election will be nullified. So many of us believe that as opposed to pay too much attention to the figures in an election, let's also pay attention to the law itself, the rules of the game, because without those rules, elections will become just a waste of our time.
All right, we'll open the phone line so you can get in touch with us and share your thoughts as quickly as you possibly can. Remember, when you call us, lower the volume on your TV set so we can get to hear you loud and clear. But as we get that working through, Raila Odinga says the IEBC does not have the moral authority to conduct the next election because they are the ones solely responsible for what happened and the annulling of the election. You know, Uhuru Kenyatta was not found culpable, really. And so he says, you guys don't have the moral authority, we need to have a new team altogether. Does his argument hold water in your view?
No, I think that will lead to a constitutional crisis. I think he's even said more than that. He's argued that his legal team, and Dr. Otiende Amolo did make that argument in closing after the court made its decision, that they're going to file criminal charges against members of the IEBC, arguing that their actions were criminal actions by declaring false results. And so I think that for me is an argument that will only plunge Kenya into a constitutional crisis, because the law requires elections to be held in 60 days. They just don't have enough time to go back and begin to appoint new electoral commissioners, to begin to have a whole new process. They just don't have the time. I think that other than focus on removal of the electoral commissioners, and I think perhaps that's the mistake people make, is what we pay too much premium on the 9 electoral commissioners who are in fact just political leaders. The engine of any election is the technical team. He is not the chairperson of the Electoral Commission. It is the secretary and his technical team, the people who transport ballot papers, who deploy polling officers, who ferry materials and bring results. That for me should be the area of focus, that we need to make that process stronger and more transparent. In Uganda, perhaps I think the most important person in an election process is Sam Rokojo. It is not the chairperson of the Electoral Commission, it's the secretary who is in charge of the day-to-day running of the Electoral Commission. So I do think that the argument by Raila and the NASA team is an argument that can only plunge Kenya into a constitutional crisis. They had better get their act together and make sure they have enough agents at all polling stations to make sure that the results declared at the polling stations are the same results that reflect at the National Tally Center.
You talked a bit about time, and the time question comes in. In our case, the presidential candidates have about 10 days to file a petition.
Similar
and
in
then
Kenya.
In 30 days, it should be dispensed of. In Kenya, you say similar for filing, but the ruling should be in about 10 days. Is it a
Yes.
week or thereabout?
Yes.
Is this time enough for this to happen? I know, of course, time is never on the side of any country to avoid a constitutional crisis, but that you are, and in our case, MPs have what? Is it 30 days? So you have a constituent, small as it is, you have 30 days. You have a whole country, you have got to run around, gather evidence in 10 days, same situation there, and then judges have got to quickly get this out of the way. And it's good that the wheels of justice move quickly, but how plausible is this, time-wise?
Well, first of all, think about it. If a country didn't have a president for more than 2 months, or there was utter uncertainty about who would be head of state, and so that's an important thing. For a small constituency, you can forget about it. You know, elections may even not be held for the entire year, and nobody's going to bother. But for a president who holds a country, it is therefore crucial that that has to be decided as quickly as possible to avoid anarchy. Secondly, candidates who take part in elections must prepare for both things, so that on the first day of campaign, you're collecting evidence. You're putting together a case that you can either make in court or to a court of public opinion. The mistake that most candidates make is before they go into a campaign, they never assemble a team of lawyers who are collecting evidence. They simply go thinking they're all going to win. I think that anybody contesting an election must prepare for an election petition from the very beginning, because that is a possibility. If you only prepare for winning, you know, perhaps you'll be overconfident. Secondly, I think that in much the same way as you must prepare a concession speech or a victory speech, you must prepare for a court challenge or indeed a marching procession if you win.
All right, let's get to our viewers. Somebody there. Hello, good morning. Okay, we'll get to that shortly. Tell me, what do you see happen in Kenya going forward? Because these two gentlemen, or at least the two sides, NASA, Jubilee, it's either ours or ours for the taking. And every side has dug in its heels. And I see an election happening and there will be a winner announced.
Yes, hello.
Okay, somebody's there. Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
What's your name, sir?
Yes, I hope you are hearing me.
Yes, we hear you loud and clear. What's your name, Chief?
Hello.
I hear you loud and clear. What's your name?
Yes, I hope you are hearing me. This is Ankton.
Yes, Ampton,
Now,
go ahead.
Where I am having a problem with the court judgment in Kenya is that it does not give a way forward. The judges decided that the run should be done, but they don't tell us who should be organizing. I believe in the Constitution, they should have thought about that situation, that in case there is a run, probably they should give the chance to the judges of the High Court to make directives on who should be the person to run the next vote. Because if you said that the problem was with the Electoral Commission, they are the ones who made a mistake. The same people to reorganize the same vote. At the end of the day, still the man is going to be coming back after 60 days, and he's still saying that they have cheated me again. Then what do? Do we again go back for the running of election now? And you're doing that with a lot of money being wasted. But this is where I'm having a problem with the Odinga. Because unlike Uganda, where the vote is tallied by Chigundu, in Kenya, the first announcement is made at the constituency level. At that time, you are adding something like 4 polling stations, and the tally sheets are around with your agent. If there is any mistake which was done in tally, you can do it on your own, and you say, this is where the mistake is.
All right.
What the chairman of the Electoral Commission, or what the Electoral Commission in Kenya is doing, is bring the maths up, putting together what is coming from every constituency. Now, really, it is very tough for any person to cheat you, because you come clear and you say, in this particular constituency, I put 1 million votes. I'm not seeing it here. I don't hear Odinga saying, this is what I polled in a particular constituency, and this is not what is represented. I just hear him talking about the process and how it was done. You know, when I compare Uganda and Kenya, if President Museveni could just accept that in Uganda, and we get that chance of saying that we added the constituents and we first certify that this is what I got in the constituents, so that when we come at the top, we just tally together what is coming from the constituents.
All right, thank you, Ampton.
Very step higher.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts.
I just implore Odinga that probably, as we are complaining about leaders who don't want to go, we should also start complaining about African leaders who don't accept when they have lost.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. A couple of things he raises, makes some comparisons here and there. Of course, he throws flack at, you know, your take on the IEBC and so on. Let's pick one or two others and then we will wrap this up. Hello, good morning. Okay, let's address what this gentleman here is saying.
Well,
many things that he has raised, but...
I don't think he has read the decision of the court, because...
Hello?
All right, we'll just speak to this person. Good morning.
Good morning, Joel.
What's your name, sir?
Hello?
I hear you loud and clear. Please carry on. Okay, we seem to have a problem. I can hear them. They cannot hear me. Please carry on if you can hear me. Okay, we'll try that one more time. Hello, good morning. Hello. Let's leave the code there. I was about to say the codes. let's leave the calls. and we'll see how we wrap this up. But you were saying, you know, he says,
No, I
look,
don't
the
think he has
IBC moral
read-
authority and so on.
I don't think he has read the decision. The court said the first respondent should organize fresh elections within 30 days. The first respondent in this case is the IEBC. So the court was very clear on who should organize the election.
Within 60 days.
Within 60 days, sorry. The court was very clear on who should organize the election because the court is cognizant of the fact that the only legitimate and constitutional body to organize the election is the IEBC. So the court made that very, very clear. Whether or not people have faith in that IEBC that in the very first place caused the problem is a different debate altogether. The second point that I think is important for Anton to note is the question he raises about leaders not accepting defeat. The person who is not accepting defeat here is not Raila. It's actually Uhuru, who has come out looking very bitter and speaking like he's in the opposition this time. So I think that it's being unfair to Raila to say that he's not accepting defeat. What I do think, though, is going to happen in Kenya is that the biggest victory that Raila has scored in his political life, and perhaps will ever score, is this court victory. I highly doubt, and perhaps I need to, let me just take a gamble here and say, I doubt Raila will win the presidency. I think
Why
that,
do you doubt that?
I think that the Jubilee coalition is now going to go all out to try and prove a case that they actually won the election. Remember that the Jubilee coalition has many more governors across Kenya than NASA. It has many more senators and women reps than NASA. And while the election in the past was about governors, NASA, I mean, now you're going to have only one election where they can marshal all their resources. They even won in opposition-led areas. And so I think that, I mean, look at Nairobi. Nairobi used to be an opposition hub. The governor of Nairobi is Sonko, you know, beats the NASA candidate. Look at areas like Mombasa. They are actually Jubilee people who came through from that area. So I do think that it's going to be very difficult for him to win that election.
Do you see Kenya at peace after that? Because you're saying, you're prognosticating that he will lose, but you see, regardless of who wins or loses, there will still be a lot of tension. Do you see Kenya at peace and not, you know, plunging back in 2008, what we saw then?
I don't think that an outblown conflict like it did in 2008 is possible in Kenya because now the repercussions of that kind of action is known. Kenya's experience with the ICC, Kenya's experience with the loss of lives in last election. So the Kenyan people have learned their lessons. So there will be, in my view, perhaps civil disobedience throughout Kenya in the months following the election, but that will fizzle out because many Kenyans, like Ugandans, live from hand to mouth. They need to go and work. If you don't work, you won't eat. If the people in Kibera slum don't work for 2 days, they won't have food. And so I do think that there might be civil disobedience in large urban areas and in perhaps NASA strongholds like in Kisumu or in Kibera in Mombasa. But I don't think that that is going to translate into a full-blown national conflict and bloodshed that we had in 2008. I think that the people who should worry most is people like Uganda because a lot of our imports really depend on Kenya. And if Kenya now will have an additional 60 days of electioneering, that will mean a disruption of our trade and trading routes. You're going to see, in my view, a spike in fuel prices, a drop in essentials import, because we actually import essentials from Kenya, the basic essentials we use every day. So you're going to have a lot of economic instability in countries like Uganda because Kenya is our root. Even if there's no violence, the fact that Kenya will just go back into an election mode, so to speak, we're going to have the economic impact in countries like Uganda, and I think we should be worried more than anybody else.
Well, we hope all goes well. Nicholas Opiyo,
but just before I take leave, it's important to note the fact that the Supreme Court in Kenya went out of its way to send its own experts to go and view the IEBC logs and servers to determine for itself. I have read the report of the registrar. It is clear that that server had serious problems. You had declaration forms that had no serial numbers for about 6 million votes. You had declaration forms that never had security marks. Those were serious problems. The court went out of its way to go and look at this server and produce its own expert report. And I think that that is a proactive attempt that people must actually, I think, perhaps reflect on, the court here must reflect on. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, is the fact that the Kenyan case was not about numbers. So the argument that Anton raised, that he hasn't had Raila speak about how many he got in this constituency, because the principal argument is the numbers as added were just wrong. So it was never about numbers, it was about process of arriving at that number. And once you establish that the process of arriving at those numbers were flawed, it therefore becomes meaningless to concentrate on numbers who you think were arrived at anyway in a process that's flawed. So it's never about numbers, it's about the process.
There you are. We wish Kenya all the very best. Nicholas Upia, as always, thank you for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you, sir.
Totally appreciate it.
Have a good week.
Coming up is my opinion. Like Kenya or hate them, truth be told, there's a lot that we have got to learn from them. And I hope that we can be humble enough to learn from these people. The appointment of their judges, many times the process arrives at what you can call a meritocracy. Now, I'm not objecting our judges here. They try, but there are issues. There are issues, and the other guys are doing it differently, and we can and should learn from them. In 57 days from today, Kenya will be going back to the polls. We hope that one will be a free and fair election. Why? Because we have got a stake in it. And like he was saying, what happens in Kenya does affect us here, whether we like it or not. So we hope that it will be a free and fair election. We hope that peace and tranquility shall prevail, and that at the end of the day, Kenyans will have in power somebody that they want to lead them. All the best to them. And all the best to you as you start out on a new week. We hope that you will achieve what you hope to achieve. That's the big story for today. Thank you for joining us. My name is Joel Senyonyi. Good morning.